Cheers. Thank you very much. So for this next bit, I'm going to keep the slides relatively slight because I'm sure that we're all aware of what a virtual machine is. You've probably used them enough times in your on-prem environments or at home in your home labs. So for those of you who might not know what a virtual machine is, think of it as it's just another instance of an operating system running on existing hardware. It's pretty much common practice now from the days of old where you'd have a rack of physical servers. You can now condense that rack into half of that size and then run multiple instances of operating systems within inside of each other. That said, I'm now going to cut over to give you guys a demo of deploying one into Azure. Oh, that's good. So as for those who were around in the last episode, Gregor did a short whistle-stop tour of the Azure portal. So this, for those who don't know, welcome to Azure. This is what you get when you log into the portal first time around. So this is, the overview once you've logged in. So what we're going to do conveniently, Lisa beforehand has created us some resource groups in here. So this is my resource group that we're going to use for the demonstration. So to create a resource, you click down on Create Resources. This then brings up a new window. And you can see that there's loads of resources here that we can pick. But for what we're going to do, we want a virtual machine. And then, as you can see here, there's loads of different versions. But the one we want is here, the virtual machine by Microsoft. And so here we go. So this gives us a breakdown of, similar to if you're used to building virtual machines inside of either Hyper-V or VMware. It's the same sort of principle. So you need to have the resource group, which we've already got created before us. And then you can just fill in all the details that you need. So for this example, we're going to deploy Windows VM. So we'll call this Windows 01. You can then pick and choose which region you want your machine to be deployed into. So because I'm based in the UK, I'm going to go for UK South. And as you can see here, it says that the recommended space is UK South. And if you hover over it, it'll usually give you a reason as to why. So it could be for capacity, or if you're wanting a larger SKU set of compute resource, this is where to go. So then next, I'm going to pick my Windows Server Data Center Edition. So an interesting thing to point out is that when you're deploying Windows Server into Azure, you can only go with the data center option. There is no standard, which obviously from a resource point, you obviously get all the features within the data center SKU for Windows Server. So we're going to pick this SKU size. Again, it'll give you a recommended with costings. So if I wanted to change this, you can see all the various different SKU sizes. So these are what are considered the general purpose, which are pretty smaller SKUs. But if you wanted to, and don't worry, Lisa, I won't deploy this into your subscription. You can go down for bigger.
Appreciate it, Simon. Thank you.
It's all right. So yeah, if you were wanting to deploy like an SQL database, for example, you can go down for the memory optimized, which give you lots and lots of memory, but then at the same time, it gives you a price to go with that. So as you asked me very nicely, Lisa, I will go for a B2 SKU, which gives us 2 virtual cores and 4 gigs in memory. And we only get 1,280 IOPS for this SKU. So if you're wanting to run an application or a workload that's really IOPS intensive, this is something to take into account. And if you need more than that, you then need to scale up the SKU to a higher SKU. So once we've selected our SKU size, we can then create our username and password. So we'll just call this Windows admin and then create a password against it. There we go. So we've got a password. Obviously, this by default, as we've already advised, this is obviously a really bad idea. So I would recommend that if you are going to expose 3389 or RDP to the world, please either put it behind a VPN or lock it down to just source IP addresses so you know who's connecting.
By the way, Simon, I heard this story about this guy doing a workshop and he deployed a virtual machine and he was real-time hacked within the time of his session.
Yeah.
And he got all of the resources deleted. So I would say, if you deploy a virtual machine, make sure to think about the security. Yeah.
Exactly. So
Just-
taking that,
Just for the
Go on,
record,
Gregor.
it wasn't me.
No.
It wasn't anyone here, and I don't want to,
No, yeah.
point fingers, but yeah, that's how quickly it can happen. I was really
Exactly.
surprised by it myself, but yeah.
So taking that brilliant point into account, Lisa, for now, we're going to not allow any outbound ports, which obviously, because this is currently public facing in terms of all being in Azure and we don't have a site-to-site VPN, once we've deployed this, we won't be able to connect to it. But that's fine, because I'm sure you're all used to seeing what the inside of Windows Server looks like. So we're just going to cover the deployment stage in Azure. So next, you move on to your disk deployment. By standard, it'll give you premium SSDs. If it's a test dev machine, you could drop that down. It'll save you a little bit of money, but obviously with saving the money, you get the compromise on performance and speed. If you then want extra data disks for your application, you can create them in here. And then you get a SKU size that you can pick and choose from. One thing that I learned out relatively young when I was getting used to my Azure life is you can't downsize disks. So if you upgrade a disk by accident, you are committed to that disk space. You cannot resize it. The only way that you can resize that disk is to create another smaller disk and then migrate the workloads over. And so once you've upsized the disk, that's it. You're committed. There is no going back. But for the demo that we're doing, we don't need any additional disks. Then next, we get to networking. So if you've not deployed any virtual networks previously, it will automatically assign one. So it'll give us the virtual network name. It will give us the subnet that it will deploy the virtual machine into. It'll then give us a public IP address if we need one. It'll then create a network security group and then ask us if we want any external ports or services exposed. From a management point, it's always useful to tick this option here to delete the public IP address in the NIC. So when you're then cleaning up your resources, once you're finished with the lab environment, instead of you having to go through and individually find them, when you come to delete that virtual machine, it'll go, oh, yes, you tick this box. So when you want me to tidy this up, we will go through and remove all of this. Again, we don't need load balancing for this example. So then for management, if you wanted to log in with your Azure AD credentials, you can enable this. Bearing in mind that for this option to work, your local client machine needs to be enrolled into your Azure AD environment. We found this out with a couple of customers where they had contractors coming in trying to use Azure AD credentials and found that actually because their machines were registered to the contractor's company, they weren't able to use this. So we ended up having to create local accounts. So just be aware of that if you get caught out by it. Again, from a cost saving perspective, you can auto shut down machines. And this basically says that at 7 p.m., it will then auto shut down. And then if you want to configure backup, you can do it from here, or we can do it. We'll probably cover that later on when we get to the recovery services vault bit. And then same for patching. You can either choose to have it done by yourself or let Windows do it automatically for you. Then for monitoring, if you want to enable any alerts for if you get any CPU spikes, that's really useful. Boot diagnostics is really useful. It basically gives you a screenshot of what's happening inside of the OS. So if you have an issue, or if it falls over, or if it's blue screen, for example, and you can't get any life or connectivity out of your virtual machine, going to the boot diagnostics tab is always really useful, and it gives you a point in time screenshot of what's happened locally. So again, for the advanced tab, so there's extensions which won't be covered for the AZ-900 exam. It allows you to do some more interesting stuff in terms of like post configuration. So you can use it to deploy antivirus or extra logging, or if you've got third-party applications that need to be able to speak to or interact with the virtual machine, you can add them there. And then finally, when we get to the tagging stage, which I know we've spoken about before, which ties back into some of the management SKU stuff that Lisa was talking about. If you've got certain environments or departments that you either want to bill against or want to monitor on, you can tag them here. So if you've got a development team, for example, that are only allowed to access this machine, or that you need to build back to a certain cost center, you could create a tag, and then you can create a report, which you can then send off to the finance team to say, hey, this machine was used so many hours this month, and this is how much it's going to cost them.
So, Simon, can I ask you a
Yes.
question? So, I think a lot of people have already used VMs, but for the people that might be watching this back and that are really, really new to Azure and have never seen a VM at all, like for what kind of customers do you deploy virtual machines on a daily basis?
It varies. So obviously, virtual machines in terms of what you can do in Azure virtual machines, it's all very. I don't want to say old school, but in terms of like the services that Azure can provide,
Hmm.
it's an old school technology. As those who manage current VM estates, it's a hassle. You have to look after them when they go wrong. It takes ages to get them patched and back up, and you have to make sure that they're all backed up. And when there's a vulnerability found, you have to go and do remediation work, and there's extra security issues around having VMs from being other people being able to access them.
Yeah, we
We're
heard.
seeing less and less people use traditional VMs. Obviously, when we come to talking about like Kubernetes and AKS, under the hood that still uses VMs, but you don't see that part of the management plane. That's
Yeah,
all managed for you by Microsoft behind the scenes, and you then just deploy your containers and your workloads
yeah.
within that. So it makes your life a lot easier.
It's the same with data resources like Databricks, Data Factory, and even Synapse Analytics. Like, if you get computational power, then under the hood, they just spin up
Yeah,
virtual machines. So that's how they do it. Yeah.
yeah.
Cool. Thank you.
No worries. So with that said, we have completed all our pre-flight checks. We've passed all the validation. So this is basically a quick overview to say what we're going to deploy and everything that we've agreed on. And then you just hit create. So we can then see this is now deploying the resource. So this is now deploying our virtual machine into a rack somewhere in the UK South data center. And depending on how many requests have gone in while we were talking about this, sometimes it can be a couple of minutes, or sometimes it can take 10 to 15 to 20 minutes, depending on how many other requests are in front of ours.
How long does it usually take to deploy Azure resources in general? Do you know?
It depends. It's a how long is a piece of string. So if you're deploying like a VPN gateway, for example, it can be anywhere from I've seen it take from 45 minutes to 2 hours.
Hmm.
Deploying VMs and storage accounts and things are usually pretty quick. Deploying an AKS cluster is not too bad, but sometimes you can just not have the Azure gods with you and it can just take
Yeah.
forever. I know Gregor can tell you some stories of trying to deploy things through infrastructure as code and trying to deploy like application gateways and front door, and the hours he spent waiting for the portal to just do its stuff.
Usually quite quick.
Yeah.
Some other services take a lot longer for obvious reasons, but yeah,
Yeah.
some of them can take a while. Most of them are
That's
quite quick.
funny.
If you want to play about with things quickly, VMs and storage accounts are probably your go-to for
Yeah.
deploying stuff quickly.
So as you can see here, Lisa, this is it done. We've deployed our virtual machine, so we can
Pretty
then go to the
quick.
resource.
Wow.
Yep. So this is the overview that gives you. So it gives us a basic breakdown of the computer name, what operating system it's running, whether it's 32 or 64-bit, SKU of the machine, and then disks. So to just give you a brief overview, because from the exam perspective, I think when I sat it, granted it was a year and a bit ago now, it was more than the questions I got were more around, I have a workload which is X. What would you recommend I deploy it into? So you don't need to know a huge amount of the ins and outs of how everything hangs together as a virtual machine in Azure. You just need to know what it is and what it can support. I have a question from Carl here. So he says, if we have time, you said it's not possible to downgrade the storage. So you can downgrade the virtual machine SKU size. So if we go to sizes, so you can obviously do this one of two ways. From a production environment, I would obviously recommend you shut down the resource first. If it's in a test and dev environment, if we wanted to scale up, so as you can see here at the moment, we've got a standard B2. If we wanted to downscale this to a B1, I can select the B1, which then gives us only one virtual CPU and 1 gig of memory. if I hit this, it will automatically start the scale down process. So it will reboot the VM while live. So you want to make sure that obviously there's no customer workload running on that at the time, and then change the SKU to be 1 core and 1 gig of memory. Does that kind of answer your question, Carl? Or are you wanting some more detail? Cool, great. So I think, the only thing to just mention is the boot diagnostics that I said. This is really useful when you're trying to troubleshoot inside of Azure. I spend so many hours looking at this when I lose a virtual machine, or if it's had a bad update and it's stuck on Windows updates, you will usually get a very black screen in here or a green screen with a spinning Windows update. And that's when you know that, okay, it's hung rebooting or updating or whatever. So then you just scroll back up to the overview page, and then you can just hit restart. So that's in a nutshell how you deploy a virtual machine into Azure. Can we jump back to the slides, Gregor, please?
Yeah, let me try and see if I can still work this. Hopefully this works out. Cross your fingers. That look all right now?
I can see us too. Oh, give it a second. Cool, great. So we've done that. So can we hop to the next slide? So this one, great. So as we've already covered, virtual machines, they're great in terms of everyone knows how they work. Everyone was brought up with them. That's fine and dandy, but there are other options that you can use. So containers are obviously a much nicer way if your application supports it. The way it was explained to me how you should treat containers is they're like cattle. VMs, with virtual machines, you spend a lot of time with them, you become friends with them, you look after them, you learn the quirks of the applications that run in them, and you end up with lots of notes on how to fix this when this part of the application falls over. With containers, it's slightly more less friendly. So if you have a problem with the container, you can basically destroy that container and it will automatically rebuild, and you can use pipelines to then inject your application processes back into it. So from a turnaround perspective, it's a lot quicker. For functions, they are great for certain workloads. So for Gregor, by all means, correct me if I'm wrong here, but a standard function that runs in Azure has a life cycle of about, is it 5 minutes?
Yeah, 5 minutes. Yeah, you can get it up to 10. 10 is the max, but it's normally 5.
Sure. So an out-of-box function will run for 5 minutes. If you have, for example, a workload or something that needs to be longer, you then have to use a premium SKU, which with everything in Azure comes with a price. So you have to put a premium app SKU in, and then you can run that workload for longer. And there's various types of functions that you can run, but the most common are probably either time-based or HTTP-based. So you can use it as like an API query hit point. So if you see something, you can then trigger that. Cool. Can I have the next slide, please? So again, this part of virtual machine scale sets and availability sets, this also is relevant for AKS as well. So AKS, for those that don't know, is Kubernetes, which is run in Azure. So it stands for Azure Kubernetes Services, which we'll cover in a minute or two. So for a VM scale set, what that basically does is it takes your virtual machine and it creates 3 instances. So within the same rack in the data center. So if one of those racks has a problem, whether it's a hardware issue or a disk failure, your application will still run because it's contained within a scale set. And then an availability set is similar to how a scale set works, but it's based on data centers within the region. So if you have a regional outage, your application will still run.
So Simon, can I ask a question real quick about this? So with the scale sets and the availability sets, does that also mean they're more expensive than just a regular virtual machine?
Nope.
No?
It's kind of like a DR scenario. So if you have, for example, the standard B2S that we just deployed, you can put that into availability set at no extra cost.
Okay, cool.
But you do pay per instance that's running. So if you have an availability set with a VM in each availability zone, you're paying for 3 VMs, not 1.
Yeah.
Okay.
Which is a very good point, because a lot of people don't realize this. When you do disaster recovery or you scale things up, every time you scale it up, you're paying, like, if it was $50 for a VM and you scale up to 2, that's now $100. A lot of people don't realize that. They think they can scale up and scale down and it doesn't cost anything. But it's a good point that if you scale up the number of instances you pay times the number of instances, how much each instance costs. So that's an important point. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Because the best way to think about it is you have a compute resource that's running in their data center, and Microsoft, as great as they are, don't like to give things away for free. So yeah, as Greg has just said, if you scale it upwards or sideways, you'll pay for that compute time. So yeah, this is just a quick overview of what scale sets were and what availability sets were. Cool. Thank you, Gregor. Can we have, I think, my last slide, I think. So yeah, AVD, for those of you who are familiar with like managing RDS farms in the on-prem world, it's very much a similar style of management in terms of you have either your VDI deployment, so you can give every user an individual workstation, or you can have a traditional shared host model, and you can deploy and scale these farms en masse. And obviously using Azure, you don't have to manage or worry about the underlying infrastructure. You can just configure them based on how you want your workloads to run. They can scale up automatically and scale down based on times, workload, and all of that fun stuff.
So since we're switching slides anyway, Simon, can you name like a scenario where you would advise a customer to use Azure Virtual Desktop?
Yes. So a good example was over the pandemic, when everyone changed from working in offices to working at home, and some customers didn't have the VPN capabilities to support 200-300 people all dialing back into their on-premise environment. I saw a couple of instances around the community and in previous workplaces where we started to deploy AVD to be able to manage that workload, and it scaled really, really well.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Okay, I think I have control now.
Just before you start, Matt, there's one question from Deep End saying, what type of workload will you use an Azure function for?
Yeah, I'll answer that if you want. Functions. So let's start. Azure functions are kind of like a function is a small bit of code that does one thing and one thing well. That's the definition of a function. So you might do things like sending out an email. That's always a good one. Sending out a PDF document. A kind of small bit of code that you run in an Azure function should run roughly in 5 minutes. So the idea is they want you to do a small bit of code quickly and efficiently. With Azure Functions, you get up to 1 million hits. You can call that function 1 million times in a month for free. So that's the beauty of Azure Functions. You can do small bits of code, repeat them a number of times for free for a month. They did bring out a thing called durable functions, which on top of Azure Functions means one function can call another function and you can store state. Because in Azure Functions, you can't store state. So you just need to do one thing that you throw away continually. And durable functions, function 1 can call function 2, and function 2 can read the state from function 1. So that's a way of chaining functions. But a good example would be maybe sending out PDFs for customer bills. That would be a good example that we've seen customers use for Azure Functions.